Social disconnection. You are at a dinner. Someone cracks a joke and the table erupts. You laugh too, a half second after everyone else, just slightly out of sync, like a dubbing error no one else notices. You reach for your glass. You nod. And somewhere in the middle of all that warmth you feel it. The glass. Not a metaphor. A sensation. A thin, invisible wall between you and every other person in the room. You are present. You are physically there. And you are completely unreachable. This is social isolation, and it has almost nothing to do with being alone. Psychologists define it as the gap between social contact and social connection. You can be surrounded by people who know your name, who laugh at your jokes, who would call themselves your friends, and still experience this particular silence. The isolation that lives not in empty rooms, but in crowded ones. John Cacioppo, who spent decades studying loneliness at the University of Chicago, found that this kind of disconnection activates the same neural threat responses as physical pain. Your nervous system does not distinguish between a broken bone and the feeling of being invisible in a room full of people. Both register as danger. And here is what makes it so hard to carry. It is invisible to everyone, including you. You keep showing up. You keep performing. You keep telling yourself that something is wrong with you for feeling this way surrounded by so many people who care. But nothing is wrong with you. You are experiencing one of the quietest, most common forms of suffering a person can carry. The loneliness that doesn't look like loneliness from the outside. The kind no one brings you soup for. Ambiguous loss. You still have their number saved. You haven't deleted it. You don't call. There is no reason to call, but you can't bring yourself to remove it either. It sits there in your contacts like an unanswered question. Evidence of someone who is, technically, still alive, but somehow already gone. Maybe it is a parent whose mind has slowly drifted away from yours, who still breathes and eats and exists, but no longer knows your name. Maybe it is a friendship that ended not with a fight, but with silence, until one day you realized you hadn't spoken in 2 years and neither of you had reached out. Maybe it is a version of yourself, the one who had a certain dream, a certain path, that you quietly buried somewhere between who you were and who life required you to become. Pauline Boss, a family therapist who worked for decades with families of missing soldiers, named this ambiguous loss, a loss without closure, without a body to bury, without a socially recognized ritual of mourning, without permission to grieve. And so the grief has nowhere to go. You can't cry at a funeral that was never held. You can't explain to people why you miss someone who is still technically there, or why you mourn a version of yourself that no one else even noticed disappear. Here is what Boss discovered. Ambiguous loss is one of the most psychologically destabilizing experiences a person can have, precisely because the human mind needs resolution. It needs to categorize, present or absent, here or gone. When the answer is both, the grief loops endlessly, unable to complete itself. You are not confused. You are not weak. You are grieving something real. The world just never built a word for it, until she did. Existential vacuum. The coffee goes cold on your desk. Not because you forgot it, you just haven't reached for it. It's been sitting there for 40 minutes while you stare at a document that doesn't need you to stare at it. You've already done everything. You replied. You submitted. You showed up. And now you're sitting in the aftermath of a productive day, feeling absolutely nothing. Not tired. Not sad. Just hollow. This is deeper than burnout. Burnout is when you've given too much and have nothing left. This is something else. This is when you start to wonder if giving it in the first place meant anything at all. Viktor Frankl called the space it lives in the existential vacuum, a profound sense of inner emptiness that descends not when life is too hard, but when life has lost its why. Frankl survived the Nazi concentration camps. He watched people die not just from physical suffering, but from the collapse of meaning. He observed that a person can endure almost anyhow, any condition, any difficulty, if they have a why, a reason, something that makes the enduring worthwhile. Existential burnout is when the why goes quiet. When you look at your life from a slight distance, at your career, your routine, your achievements, and feel like an actor who no longer remembers why they took the role. Everything still technically works. The performance continues, but the soul has quietly stopped believing in the script. Here is what Frankl understood that most productivity culture refuses to admit. The emptiness is not a malfunction. It is a message. Your psyche is not broken. It is honest. It is telling you that the life you are living was built for someone else's definition of a good life, and it is asking you, quietly but persistently, to build one that is yours. The exhaustion is not the enemy. It is the compass. Identity diffusion. Think about who you were this morning at work. The voice you used, the posture, the particular version of your opinions you chose to express. Now think about who you were the last time you were home with your family. Different, yes? Now alone at 2 a.m. Different again. This is not dishonesty. This is not performance, exactly. This is something more unsettling. The growing suspicion that there is no single person underneath all these versions. That you have been wearing masks for so long that you no longer know where the masks end and the face begins. Carl Jung called these masks the persona, from the Latin word for the theatrical masks worn in ancient drama. The persona is not inherently pathological. We need different faces for different worlds. The problem arrives when the masks multiply faster than the self beneath them can keep up. Jung described this as inflation of the persona, the gradual displacement of genuine selfhood by the accumulated roles we perform. The face beneath begins to blur. Identity diffusion sets in. You lose the thread. Erik Erikson, who spent his career mapping the stages of psychological development, saw identity not as a fixed thing, but as an ongoing negotiation, something you build and rebuild throughout life. He observed that people who never find what he called identity consolidation, a stable inner core they can return to, often experience chronic restlessness, an inability to commit, a feeling of perpetually performing a life rather than living one. And here is the therapeutic insight that changes everything. The fragmentation is not a sign that you have no self. It is a sign that you have been so busy surviving different environments that you never had the space to ask what remains when all the performances end. The self does not need to be one fixed thing, but it does need a center, a quiet place you can return to when all the masks come off and you are finally just alone with yourself. That place already exists. You have simply not been still enough, long enough, to find it. Unlived life. You're watching someone perform, a musician, an artist, someone who left a stable career to build something on their own, and you feel something that you're embarrassed to name. It's not quite admiration. It's something more uncomfortable, something that burns slightly. You recognize it later alone. It's not about them. It's about a door you passed without opening. A version of yourself who took the other road. James Hollis, a Jungian analyst who has spent his career studying what he calls the unlived life, describes it this way. When we choose safety over self, when we follow the practical path, the expected path, the path that made everyone else comfortable, the parts of us that needed the other road don't die. They go underground. They go quiet. They wait. And they make themselves known in ways that are hard to trace back to their origin. As restlessness at 3 a.m. when the house is quiet, and you suddenly can't remember why you're living this particular life. As a strange grief for something you never actually had, but somehow lost. As envy, that burning, specific kind, when you watch someone else dare the thing you didn't. Here is what Hollis understands, and what most of us were never taught. The unlived life is not evidence of failure. It is evidence of depth. The fact that there is a road you didn't take means there was more of you than the life you chose could contain. And here is the insight that can change everything. The unlived life does not need to be lived in full. It does not require you to quit your job or end your marriage or rebuild from scratch. It asks only to be acknowledged, named, given a few hours a week, a practice, a direction. The underground self doesn't need everything. It simply needs to know it hasn't been forgotten. There is more of you than the world has gotten to see. That's not a tragedy. It's an invitation. Exposure anxiety. You've written something, or painted something, or had an idea that you know, quietly, is the most honest thing you've ever thought. and it has been sitting in a folder or a notebook or just in your head for months, maybe years. You tell yourself it isn't ready, that you need to work on it more, refine it, wait for the right moment. But you know, somewhere underneath that rationalization, that the real reason is different. The real reason is that this one is real. And if you show something real to the world and the world finds it lacking, you won't be able to hide behind, "It wasn't my best work." Because it was. This is exposure anxiety, and it is entirely different from stage fright or performance nerves. Stage fright is about capability. Exposure anxiety is about identity. The fear is not, "What if I fail?" The fear is, "What if I show you who I actually am and you don't want it?" Brené Brown, whose research on vulnerability has redefined how psychology understands courage, identified that this fear often has a specific origin. For many people, being truly seen was dangerous at some point, not metaphorically, but literally. They showed something real and it was mocked, dismissed, punished, or simply met with indifference. And the nervous system, designed to protect you, recorded the lesson. Being visible is threatening. Cover yourself. The tragedy is that this protection calcifies. The boundary that kept you safe when you were young becomes the wall that keeps your work from reaching the people who need it. The real thing stays hidden. The world gets a smaller, safer, more palatable version. And you spend years wondering why nothing feels like it matters. Not realizing that what you're aching for is the feeling of being fully received. Not praised, received. This is the work. Not to eliminate the fear of being seen, but to understand that the fear is a scar, not a verdict. It is the record of a wound, not the truth about what will happen next. Dysthymia. You went to the party. You laughed at the right moments. You have always been good at that. Someone told you that you seemed so together, so positive, and you smiled and said thank you. On the drive home, you turned the music up loud because the silence felt like something. And then you were home, and the quiet was everywhere, and you sat for a moment before getting ready for bed. Just sat, and felt absolutely nothing. Not sad exactly, not in pain, just gray, flat. The color slightly turned down on everything. That gray has been there for a long time. Long enough that you've started to suspect it might just be you. Your baseline, your personality. What you may be experiencing is called dysthymia, clinically persistent depressive disorder. And it is the form of depression that mental health culture talks about least, because it is the hardest to see, including from the inside. Unlike major depression, dysthymia doesn't take you out of your life. It lets you keep going. You achieve things. You maintain relationships. You function, sometimes impressively. But underneath all that functioning, there is a chronic, low-grade absence. The feeling that the texture has been sanded off of life. That things that should feel like something don't quite manage it. The cruelty of dysthymia is that its invisibility becomes a trap. You keep waiting to feel worse before you allow yourself to get help. You look at the people who really have depression, the ones who can't get out of bed, and you tell yourself you don't qualify. You're still getting out of bed. You're still showing up. What do you have to complain about? But here is what the research on dysthymia consistently shows. The absence of acute suffering does not mean the absence of suffering. And chronically living with this gray does real damage to your sense of yourself, to your capacity for joy, to the texture of your whole life. You do not need to hit a floor to deserve help. The fact that you can function through it does not mean you should have to. You deserve to live a life that actually has color in it. Not someday. Not when things get bad enough. Now. Kenophobia. Notice what you do in the elevator. In the space between one floor and another, maybe 30 seconds, there is a very good chance that you took out your phone. Not to check anything specific. Not because you received a notification. Just to fill the space. Just because 30 seconds of nothing felt like too much. We have become extraordinarily bad at empty space. Not just the physical kind, the mental kind. The gap between thoughts. The pause between tasks. The moment when nothing is demanding your attention and you might, if you stayed there long enough, have to feel something. This is kenophobia, the fear of voids, of emptiness. And Blaise Pascal named the phenomenon in the 17th century with a precision that should embarrass us. All of humanity's problems, he wrote, stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. We have not solved this problem in 400 years. We have found increasingly sophisticated ways to avoid confronting it. The average person now switches between tasks or devices every 47 seconds. We have filled the last quiet spaces of daily life, the commute, the waiting room, the walk between two places, with content, with noise, with the beautiful, endless, perfectly engineered stimulation designed to ensure that the silence never quite arrives. And yet, the silence is not the enemy. The silence is not where the bad things live. The silence is where you live, your actual self, the one beneath the roles and the noise and the relentless performance of being okay. William James, the father of American psychology, believed that the self was not located in the activity, but in the gap between activities. Not in what you do, but in what you notice when you stop. The emptiness you are afraid of is not empty at all. It is full of the one thing that chronic distraction is designed to prevent: contact with yourself. The version of you that has been waiting patiently under all the noise for you to finally go quiet enough to hear it. You don't have to sit for an hour. You don't have to meditate. You just have to resist the reflex, once, today, to reach for the phone in the elevator, and see what rises in you when you don't.